All right, welcome to this two-part series on the Roaring Twenties and its impact on society. All right, the United States, by the end of World War One, is being recognized as a Western power, one of the superpowers of the world. By this time, Great Britain still has the largest empire in the world. France is still a world power as well. Germany is defeated, and they're about ready to. They're suffering their depression now. But in the United States, the 20s was a time of prosperity and expression of the arts. It was also a time in rural America where life was already hard. The farmers were already experiencing depression-like symptoms by the mid-20s. Your coal miners, your railroad strikes, those were going on also by the early to mid-20s. So let's take a look at the 20s. After World War One, many Americans wanted to return to isolationism. Remember, the United States didn't get involved in World War One until 1917 because the United States policy was to be isolated from foreign affairs. After its involvement in World War One, Americans were like, hey, we did our part. Now we need to come back home and have a wonderful, flourishing life. Why was there prosperity in the 1920s? And for a lot of people, the 1920s was a very prosperous time. One of them was the impact of the automobile or the car, and the reason actually started in the 1910s, but by the 1920 had become prominent in American society, and that's basically the Model T. The Model T was made by the Ford Motor Company and Henry Ford, and he used the assembly line to make cars cheaper and more readily available. Because he was able to mass produce vehicles, they were no longer toys of the wealthy. And so all the infrastructure needed for automobiles also started coming in as well. Gas stations. Think about the last time you went to a gas station. Did you just buy gas? I bet you a lot of you did not. I bet you a lot of you asked your parents to get you something there, a candy bar or a Coke or a slushie or whatever it was, okay? And truth be told, that's how gas stations make their money. They really don't make much off the gasoline. If you talk to anybody who owns a gas station or a manager of a gas station, they'll tell you the truth. They don't make much off the gasoline. The gasoline is a draw to bring your vehicle in, and then when you get there, you end up buying something else, and the something else is where they make their profit. Of course, with gas stations and restaurants, it also opened up the tourism business because people began to travel. And today, we don't even think anything of going to the next town and eating, like eating at a restaurant in Marietta when we live in Parkersburg. But, at one time, that was kind of a all-day trip. Now that's just like something you can go and do and then come back home all in the same day. And it was because of the automobile that became a possibility. Second reason for prosperity was you had the widespread usage of electricity starting to become prominent in America's urban centers. Urban means cities. So in America's urban centers, you have electricity, and all the stuff that electricity can provide became options to buy. For example, a radio, or vacuum cleaner, or a toaster, or a waffle maker, or just about, or light bulbs, or any of these things. All of these things were dependent upon electricity. And by the 1920s, all your major urban areas had electricity. Now notice I keep saying urban areas because rural areas, there were areas where electricity still had not reached. We'll talk about that when we talk about the 1930s. And of course, more efficient production techniques like the assembly line allowed workers not to have to be experts about the things they made, just an expert on the one little part that they were supposed to put together. I'll give you an example. I really suck at fixing cars. That's the truth. However, I could work in an automobile factory in the 1920s or even today. You know why? Because when you work on a factory line, you're trained to do one little piece of the vehicle to put together. And then a conveyor belt brings the car to you, and you put that one part on. And each person on the conveyor belt assembly line, all they do is put one part on. Well, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm not a genius when it comes to fixing cars, but I can learn to do one thing on a car and do it over and over and over and over again. This is the assembly line technique. And so you can make unskilled labor semi-skilled labor, so to speak, and you can come up with, like, for example, the Model T. With all these assembly line products, you had mass consumption. That's a large amount of items that are being produced, purchased, and used. Efficient production techniques make huge quantities of goods available, and people have money to spend on them. Okay, and that's mass consumption in a nutshell. So during the 1920s, there are going to be three forms of changes in American society: the political changes, economic changes, and the social changes. In this first part of the video, we're going to look at the political changes. In the second part of the video, we will look at some of the economic and social changes. That will be in part 2. All right, so I want you to look at this list. These are the presidents of the 1920s that were elected in the 1920s. And simply put, you'll notice they are all Republican. They were business friendly. And so at this time period, you had laissez-faire economics or capitalism. And in capitalism, the theory is that your hands should be off. The government should have as little interference with business as possible. That keeps taxes lower, and businesses can then reinvest that income into their business, in theory, and thus basically hire more people. In theory, that works. But in other times in American history, that does not work, and that's the struggle, honestly, of the modern age of American history. On one side, you have the Republicans, and the Republicans, like I said, they're going to be more hands-off with business, and they're going to emphasize more freedoms, but less safety nets. So during the 1920s, if you lost your job, there was nothing. They didn't have welfare, they didn't have Social Security, they didn't have any of that stuff. And during the 1920s, the economy was really, really booming. It was doing very well. However, when times are bad, in laissez-faire economics, it's still hands-off. And when times get bad and people are suffering, the government also doesn't get involved in laissez-faire capitalistic economics. On the political left, you have the Democrats, and the Democrats tend to favor higher taxes and less freedoms, but more safety nets. And for the last 120 years or so, that's been the major political question of the United States. How much government do we want? How much of a safety net do we want? Do we want lower taxes and more freedoms, but at the same time, if you fall on your face, you're on your own? Or do we want the government to take care of us, as people on the left would, or the Democrats, or even left of the Democrats would want? Or are you on a sliding scale somewhere in between? Do you tend to lean right, but you don't want to go all the way right? Do you tend to lean left, but you don't want to go all the way left? That is the major political question of the 20th and 21st century here in the United States. Now, Warren Harding came to the presidency with a quote-unquote desire for a return to normalcy. America needed to get back to normal business. That was his big statement. And his big thing was to stay out of foreign affairs. It's time to not be part of that anymore. Now, unfortunately, towards the end of his presidency, he became known for a lot of scandals. A lot of his government workers were involved in scandals, especially in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, where they accepted bribes from businessmen in exchange for government oil fields. These government oil fields, they were on federal property, and private businesses were drilling on public property for oil. And this was very controversial. For the sake of our country, it may have been best what ended up happening. Harding ended up passing away. And so when Calvin Coolidge became president, he became president, and his big thing was to stay cool with Coolidge. Everybody, keep your cool, okay? He took over after Harding's death, and then he was committed to business and a laissez-faire approach to the economy. And from 1923 to 1929, the economy was doing very, very well as a whole in the United States. Also during his presidency, the United States passed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was an agreement with the nations of the world to outlaw war, except in self-defense. Well, you probably already know by the 1930s, the world is at war. So what happened? Well, the problem was there's no way to enforce this pact. And no enforcement often means no actual law. Let me give you an example. I live on a dirt road, and the dirt road actually has a speed limit sign on it. It says 5 miles an hour. Now, I'm going to tell you the truth. Nobody goes 5 miles an hour on that dirt road. Nobody. I mean nobody. In fact, the neighbors' kids go out there with their little motorcycles, and they go out and pop wheelies out on the dirt road, and they're going, a lot of times they'll take their motorcycles and go 40, 45 miles an hour up and down that road, you know, and I'm basically like, high five, that looks cool, pop a wheelie again, right? Well, why can they get away with that? I mean, it says 5 miles an hour on the sign. So why can they get away with that? A police officer is never going to come on my dirt road and sit there with a radar gun. See, even though there's a rule, there's no way to enforce it. It's the same thing, okay? And that was the problem with the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Now, while the economy was booming during the 1928 election, Herbert Hoover was elected president and was sworn in as president in 1929, in March of 1929. And he promised to help end poverty and unequal distribution of wealth in the United States through laissez-faire government. In other words, what he was preaching was something called trickle-down economics. The problem was, at this time period, if you really looked at the economy, there were problems, major problems. But nobody was paying attention because the problems were not in the cities. The problem was in the rural countryside. We're going to talk about that in part 2. Farmers weren't doing well. People in coal mines, working in coal mines, weren't doing well. People in the railroad industry weren't doing well anymore. And their economic bubble had already burst. And so the bubble of the cities hadn't busted yet. And so on October of 1929, Black Tuesday, the Great Depression would begin, and Herbert Hoover would be stuck trying to fix the economy that was absolutely broken. And a lot of historians don't see that he was up to the task. We'll talk about that when we talk about the 1930s as well. Now, many people experienced an economic boom in the 1920s. We talked about that, but who did not? Well, basically, farmers and minorities, especially Native Americans and African Americans. And let's talk about each of those 3 groups. First off, small farmers are hurt by the economy because they were selling a lot of their crops overseas during World War I. But World War I ends, and the farms over in Europe began producing food again, and they became experts at mass producing crops. Well, when there's a whole bunch of crops in the market, the price of those goods are going to be way down. So the price of wheat and corn and beans and all those, they all fell. And during the war, our government encouraged farmers to take out loans to purchase things like tractors so that they can mass produce food. Now, with the drop in food prices, they weren't able to pay off their loans. 1 in 4 farmers foreclosed in the 1920s. They lost their farm to the bank. Native Americans, most of them were living on reservations, and they had few luxury goods. There was a high unemployment rate. Alcoholism became high during the 1920s on Native American reservations. And a lot of the benefits of the 1920s technology did not make it to the reservations yet during this time period. And so a lot of Native Americans had a short lifespan. In fact, Native Americans had the shortest average lifespan of any ethnic group during the 1920s. And then African Americans. They faced extreme discrimination. Segregation in the South was still legal. There was de facto segregation in the North, which means that even though there wasn't always a law, in culture it was that way. There were certain neighborhoods, for example, African Americans would not be welcome to. And the 1920s saw the KKK grow to its largest extent, and they were against African Americans, Jews, Eastern European immigrants, Asian immigrants, Latinos, basically anybody that wasn't white. And it's an embarrassment in American history, but in 1927, the KKK, they marched down the streets of Washington, D.C. So it was a tough time for African Americans as well. A lot of African Americans, remember I said the farms weren't doing well. In the South, a lot of African Americans were sharecroppers. They lived on a plantation, and they were paid by the plantation owner when crop prices dropped, they were fired. And so they basically, you had what was called the Great Migration. Large amounts of African Americans left the South and moved into American cities like Chicago, Kansas City, Memphis, New Orleans, New York, Pittsburgh, Detroit. And so that happened in the 1920s. All right, that's where we're going to leave off on part 1. We'll pick up part 2 with social changes. See you then.